Now let's look deeper into the supply of labor. Now the supply of labor, really we want to ask the question of how would employees or potential employees respond to an increase in wages. That is, where for the same amount of time you'd be paid more for that time. Like, will people end up working more or working less? Well, it ends up there are two effects. One of them we can call the substitution effect. With the substitution effect, we really think of the wage as being the price of leisure. After all, with any hour I can either work or I can not work. Right, so I can spend time sleeping, watching television, what have you. And any time that I spend doing those things is time that I'm not working to earn the wage. So you can really think of the price of sitting in my living room watching the TV for an hour as being the wage that I could earn during that hour. Which would then indicate that higher wages makes leisure more expensive. But as we know, if things get more expensive, we tend to buy less of it. As a result, if I'm consuming less leisure, I'm going to end up working more. Right? So we'll have a greater quantity of labor supplied. So according to the substitution effect, that will be the relationship. The higher wages are, the more people will tend to work, as leisure has gotten more expensive. But then there's the income effect. Now the income effect suggests that leisure is probably a normal good. We would normally expect that the wealthier you are, the more time you spend enjoying leisure, all else equal. Whereas if you're relatively poor, you're going to spend a lot of time working. You can't really afford to enjoy leisure, in effect. Well, if that's true, then higher wages, we know, lead to you having a higher income, a greater level of wealth. As a result, you would tend to buy more leisure, not less. With the result, then, you're going to work less, and therefore less labor would be supplied at higher wages. So we see these two different effects cut different ways. On the one hand, because of substitution effects, higher wages mean that leisure is more expensive, so we would tend to work more. On the other hand, higher wages means that we have more income with which to buy leisure. If we're going to have more leisure, we end up working less. Now, another way of thinking of the income effect is to think of income targets and say there's a certain amount of money that I'm trying to earn. If that's the case, then the higher the wage is, the less I have to work in order to hit that target. So we have the substitution effect and the income effect, pushing two different ways. Substitution effect suggests that at higher wages, more labor will be supplied. The income effect suggests that at higher wages, less labor is going to be supplied. So it's not immediately clear which of these is going to predominate. Well, here are two ways to try to reconcile the substitution and income effect. These are two options that you might see relatively commonly. The first is the most common. That's what we call the backward bending supply curve. Here with the backward bending supply curve, the suggestion is, at very low wages, the substitution effect is really what matters. So if I'm very poor and then wages go up, I'm going to say, oh, well, leisure is getting more expensive, so I'm going to go out and I'm going to work more. So at very low wages, people respond to higher wages by offering to work more. On the other hand, when wages get very high, then the income effect starts taking over. So people start saying, well, I'm making a lot of money, I'm making even more money for every hour, so I may as well take some more time off, go on vacation more, that sort of thing. Right? So this suggests that there's some kind of cutoff. Right? There's some wage where we're going to put forth the maximum amount of work where these two effects are balanced. If the wage is above that, we will work less, but at the same time, if the wage is below that, we will work less. Another possibility, which is suggested actually by this target income sort of idea, is an S-shaped supply curve, like we see here on the right. This suggests that at some kind of medium range, the income effect is really what matters. This would be a range of wages in which it's relatively easy for us to hit our target level of income. So if the wage goes up a little bit, we can cut back how many hours we work a little bit. If the wage goes down a little bit, we work a little bit more in order to offset that, so that in the end, anywhere in this range, you'd make basically the same amount of income. But then there's the high range and the low range. In each of these, the substitution effect would tend to dominate. Now here the logic is relatively simple. When you look at low wages, imagine the wage is, say, a penny an hour. In that case, for you to earn something like $1,000 a month is virtually impossible. You would have to work 100,000 hours. Now, I've not done the math, but I'm reasonably confident there are not 100,000 hours in a month. In fact, it's much closer to, say, 750 hours in a month or so. Right? So there's no way you could possibly hit your target income. So when we hit these very low wages, people stop thinking about their target income and really just start thinking about, is it worth it to work this amount of time, given the fact that I'm having to give up leisure to do it? So, once we've given up the target level of income, then the substitution effect starts being what matters. So at very low wages, we would expect the substitution effect to be what matters. Until we get to a point where the wage is such that we can hit our target level of income, then we start thinking about that as the wage increases. As a result, the income effect would be important there. But eventually we hit the point where the target income is so easy to reach that we actually abandon it and say, well, we may as well make more money since it's so easy to do so. That would be at very high wage levels. We would expect people to work more the greater their wages are. So this is just a different interpretation of how we can reconcile the substitution and income effects. Now, the problem is trying to tease out which of these, or we can imagine other options too, which of them is technically true is very hard to tell, seeing as we can only really observe a very small part of any individual supply curve at any point in time. After all, as time changes, it's very possible my supply curve might shift. So if I observe 2 points, it's not even obvious that they're on the same supply curve. Right? So it might very well be that the supply curve shifted on me. So I'm looking at 2 points on 2 different curves, which tells me nothing about the curve itself. So the good news then, seeing as now we've entered a world of supply that is really quite strange and perhaps confusing, is that at the individual level, we do have some evidence that there is some kind of backward bending going on. Now it might be that the backward bending is over some very large range, or it might be over a very narrow range. But there is some evidence that there is some range in which the curve bends backward. Right? So it might be an S shape, it might be straight up backward bending like we had before. The evidence for that comes largely from studying the behavior of taxicab drivers. Taxicab drivers sometimes have the option of deciding how many hours they work. Since they're paid, in effect, on a commission basis, just paid based on how many people ride the cab and for how long, it ends up that they can just call off and say, well, I don't want to make any more money today, or they can work additional hours and make additional money. So, they have some choice in how many hours they work. This is very different from, say, a factory worker who is slated to work 7.5 or 8 hours a day and really doesn't have any choice in the matter. And so the taxicab drivers are a good place to look since they do have some choice. And there is evidence that on days that we'd expect them to be earning more each hour, that they work fewer hours. Specifically, we look at rainy days versus sunny days. Rainy days, people really don't want to walk around cities, so they're much more likely to take the cab, which means the cab isn't going to be empty very much, so the cab driver is making money pretty much the entire time they're driving. In other words, their wage is much higher. We find out on those days, taxicab drivers also tend to take off a little bit earlier, that on relatively sunny days, where odds are good, their taxi is going to be somewhat more empty. Now at the industry level, the good news is that supply seems relatively normal, in that if you draw a standard supply curve, upward sloping, higher wages indicate more people willing to work, then that's actually what we see once you get to an industry level or market level. So we get a standard upward slope. We don't have to worry about any kind of backward bending once you get beyond the individual level. Of course, this raises a rather serious question, and why? Why is that the case, that at the individual level we do see backward bending, but it doesn't show up once we start adding people together? Well, the reason seems to come from the extensive versus the intensive margin. This is a term that economists use to distinguish 2 different ways that the supply of labor in a market could possibly change. Now, the extensive margin indicates the number of people that are willing to work or not willing to work. So here, we just call out the point that when you're making the decision to work or not, really only the substitution effect matters. If you don't work, you're not going to hit any target income. So the target income will not enter into your decision making when you say, well, I want to work or I don't want to work. So working or not is only determined by the substitution effect. So that extensive margin, really only the substitution effect is going to matter for that. The higher the wage, the more likely people are to say, yes, I'm going to go look for a job. Now the intensive margin is really all about how much any individual person works. Right. So, putting it another way, the extensive margin, as that adjusts, we'd say that more people work or fewer people work. Along the intensive margin, the people that are working work more or work less. Well, the intensive margin is what we get when we look at these individual level supply curves. So it may be that they have substitution and income effect. They might cancel out in some way. It might be income effects matter more along certain ranges, whether it be a medium or high level of wages. So the intensive margin is a little bit more difficult to predict how it's going to go. Well, it ends up in the market as a whole that really it's the extensive margin that matters. The quantity of labor out there in the market adjusts far more from people deciding to enter or leave the workforce rather than people deciding to pick up some overtime or not. So in the end, the extensive margin is really what's going to drive the behavior of labor markets.